This is going to be fun. It is a gouache day today, and we are going to do some improvisation. Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Margot Halleck, and in today's video, I'm going to take you behind the scenes with me as I create a brand new piece for my collection. This is going to be a gouache painting, and it's going to be kind of an improvisational piece. So I have a general idea of what I want to do, but I haven't really figured out all the elements of how this is going to come together. So we're going to do it together. And I'm going to do it with the help of this new set that I have by Caran d'Ache. And this is Caran d'Ache's gouache pan set. And I was actually really interested to try this out because pans are not something that you see quite as often for gouache. Usually they're sold in tube format. There is one tube in this, which is a tube of white. But typically you won't really find gouache as often in this pan format. And I know that Caran d'Ache has an excellent reputation for, watercolor pencils, and writing instruments in general, but I've never used their gouache. So we are going to take this out for a spin as I create a really fun ballet scene from one of my favorite ballets, which is The Firebird. So without further ado, let's dive right in. The Firebird is actually both a ballet as well as a folk story out of Russia. But what's going to be intriguing here is I'm going to do a little bit of a play on warm and cool colors. And so it's going to be of the couple in the middle of a woodsy kind of forest. So we're going to start with the background first, and that's usually how I like to work with everything. But with gouache, it's a little bit different because unlike watercolors where you block off your lighter areas and avoid the areas where you're painting white, with gouache, you can be a little bit more flexible. And so I can work by doing an entire background without worrying so much about safekeeping my light areas, and then add whatever appears on the foreground as a separate layer. And so you'll see as I'm working through this how that works. But the way that you work with gouache is quite different from how you work with watercolors, just by the very nature of the fact that gouache is an opaque medium. So I actually believe that gouache tends to be much more versatile in general than watercolor because you can get really light, airy washes of color, kind of like what I'm doing here, which is very watercolor-esque with these vertical lines that I'm using to evoke trees in a forest. And we'll get to that in a second. But it can kind of double up both as watercolor looking as well as flatter and more graphic looking. So back to this forest, I'm using watercolor-like washes and creating these vertical kind of abstract lines to evoke the idea of a forest. And I love the idea of not getting too literal and not getting too hung up on the details of what the tree trunks look like, and maybe making it a little bit more abstract too. So one thing that I like to do with gouache in general is I tend to really like to add white pigment to my paints in order to thicken them and make them more opaque. So if you want your layers to be less see-through, then a really great and quick way of doing that is to add white to that paint. And that's what I've done here, and I've added a little dab of white on each of my wells in the cool color territory, so that I have the flexibility to either make it more opaque or not, depending on which areas of the painting I'm getting to. And so I'm working some different values here in the corners and trying to keep it, again, still with that green and blue color family, because what's going to happen is as I work in the two people in the middle, so my focal point, I'm going to make them in warmer colors, and that's going to make them really stand out and pop off this background. So as you can see, I've started working on the second layer of this gouache painting. And I kind of like to compare it to in a theater where you have this diorama-like stage set where you've got like cardboard cutouts and each cutout has like a different layer of the scene going on. So I'm thinking of this gouache painting kind of like that, where we're seeing 3 or 4 layers that are somewhat flat, but but add some visual depth in a very stylized way. And I'm alternating between sort of this apple green, a mix between yellow and green, as well as a cobalt-like blue, and varying between these as much as I can to still keep it within the same background, but not having it read as too flat. And I also love the idea of adding these little tabs to my vertical lines, which in this very simple way kind of evokes birch trees, to me anyway. So just adding these very, very simple little details just helps pull things in the direction of something a little bit more representational and less abstract than the original vertical lines that I was doing at the very beginning of this painting. And I'm actually also really loving what happens when I add little pops of yellow too. So let's add a little bit more of that. There's a fair amount of, doing things on the fly and just experimenting and seeing how things go. And that's an aspect that I really love about gouache, is the fact that you can do that and get away with it, because if something doesn't work out, you can always go over it with another layer and it's not too big of a deal, unlike watercolor where you're really locked in place once you make those decisions. So as you can see, I'm kind of improvising as I go. And because I loved how those yellows and those very light greens looked, then I'm going to keep rolling with that. And I'm going to be careful also not to overdo it too, because there is such a thing as too much of a good thing. So now I'm going to start creating my main focal point, which is the couple or the dancers who are going to be in the middle of this forest. And so with gouache, like I mentioned before, you can really just paint over your backgrounds because your paint colors are completely opaque. And so you don't have to worry too much about show through or having to block off your light areas. You really have free reign to take whatever color it is you want, no matter how dark or light it is, and paint over your background and still have those colors really pop off that page. So for this couple, I'm actually going to freehand this. And, for dancers specifically, because I've been doing this for such a long time, it comes really naturally to me at this point to be able to freehand it. But if you are not comfortable with freehanding your illustration, another thing that you can do is actually create a pencil sketch on top of your background. And guess what? Your gouache will cover that up as well. So it's a really great way of working step by step and building layer upon layer. So let's get this body all drawn in, and I'm going to do the body in this sort of cream or very pale skin tone, and then build the costume on top of that. It's kind of the same premise as those Victorian paper dolls where you have the body and then you can add layers on top of that. And sometimes for me, I think that like thinking about gouache less as painting like watercolors and more as like a collage kind of helps me figure out how to block things off. And so if you imagine each layer being like literally a cutout piece of paper, that might help you kind of get into the spirit and the idea of how to work with this particular medium in the way that, in my belief, it was intended to be used. I'm also trying to bring in some of those creams from my figures into some of the foliage, and part of that is my philosophy of trying to create cohesion in a painting by making sure that the colors that appear in some areas are sprinkled throughout the entire painting itself. And I have a video all about that and where I go into detail about it, so I will link it in the description below so that you can check it out if you're interested. Now that I have my first figure blocked off, I'm going to start adding the costume, very much like what I said earlier, like the paper doll kind of comparison, where I'm going to take some red and I'm going to layer that on top of my body. It's generally a good idea to let your gouache layers dry before each consecutive layer. However, I like the idea sometimes of using the wet layer underneath to let it blend just a little bit with my top layer. And that kind of makes those two layers feel a little bit more connected to one another as opposed to completely separate entities. It's sort of similar, I guess, to wet on wet technique for watercolor, in a sense that you can have a little bit of those colors blending into one another, which creates really interesting, buttery, painterly effects that in a way somehow reminds me also a little bit of oil painting somehow. So let's get that going here on this dress. And I'm filling in the tutu now and not worrying so much about some of the show through that's going on, because I can always do a second pass over any areas that have some of the background showing. So again, it's layering over layering over layering, and that really builds to the sophistication and the visual interest of the painting. So let's keep on going with this and add some of the other details like this fun feathery headpiece. And I'm going to add my second figure as well. So I'm building it step by step and really just going with the flow. I mean, there's something to be said for letting go and, yes, it's a good idea to plan your painting and to have an idea of the general direction that you're going in, but sometimes it's really a great idea just for your own mental health to experiment and have fun. And this really should be a fun process, especially, painting, we get so caught up in trying to be perfect or trying to achieve a specific result that we're going for, that very often a lot of people, myself included, forget to just have fun and experiment and play with our materials. And it's in those moments of playing and taking risks and not really caring so much about what the end result is going to be that we learn the most about ourselves and about new techniques that we might develop that could be useful down the line. So try not to forget that, even though, everybody wants a nice painting. Everyone wants to have a success at the end. But remember, success can come in many different forms, and learning something about yourself that could make you a potentially better artist down the road is worth so much more than just the outcome of one single painting. So speaking of a single painting, we are getting close to the end of this, and I don't know if you guys noticed what I did here, which was I made sure to make my figures warmer colors to counter the cooler colors in the background. It's a color theory trick that I use a lot, and if you're not familiar with color theory, I have a video all about color theory, but there are so many ways to use that to your advantage to create really interesting effects on paintings. And let me know if you want me to create a video all about advanced color theory techniques, because I think where a lot of people get confused is they think that color theory is just an academic thing that you don't really use very much in practice, when in fact there are so many ways that you can use that in practice that can bring about some really, really gorgeous effects. So let me know if you're interested in that and I can create a video about it. All right, we're reaching the end of this painting, and I'm just going to add some details for the eyes and the facial features. And I'm not going to get too hung up on, specific facial features, because that's not what this painting is about. This painting is really mostly about a mood and a color scheme and it feeling very painterly. And it's kind of an abstraction nearly of the idea of this Firebird folk story that I don't really want to get too detailed about the faces, because I don't really care that much. It's really more about the overall mood and feeling and that color pop that I'm really going for here. So I think I'm pretty happy with this so far, and I think we're just about done here. So I hope this video was helpful, and let me know in the comments below if there are any tutorials or topics that you want me to cover in more detail in this channel. Because when I started out, I really wanted, and I still want, to build this channel to be something where I can fill in the blanks and the voids for where you feel like you're missing out on information. So whether that's learning how to draw something specific or paint something specific, tutorials, techniques, mindset things to help you along in your art journey, that kind of thing. I really want to tailor this to what it is you're looking to learn. So let me know. As always, thank you so much for watching and for joining me. And if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button so you can watch other videos just like this one. And I will see you next week for another art video.